The passage speaks of the use of airplanes for military purposes. That's the primary subject, that's the overall premise. The first country to do this was Italy. Some history about this is given. Next, we say then Bulgaria followed this example. The first war to see the use of airplanes in military purposes, for military purposes, was World War I. The Allies and Central Powers both used airplanes and airships extensively. And the last statement is also talking about the military use of airplanes because they're talking about the context of World War I. Let's look at the options. A says, beginning with Italy in the early 20th century, the use of airplanes for military purposes proliferated to most nations in the world by World War I. We find that this is quite okay. There's only one problem with this. It starts with the mention of Italy, and the use of airplanes for military purposes comes later on. That is something that the passage does the other way around. First it mentions the use of airplanes for military purposes, and then it takes the example of Italy. So let's see if we can find a better option that maintains the order of subjects. B says the proliferation of airplanes began with Italy and then continued on till the First World War. This is extremely limited because it completely omits the mention of the phrase which represents the central premise, the use of airplanes for military purposes. Of course, this does talk about the First World War, but we see that this is the primary subject, so it has to be included in the summary. Hence, B definitely is limited. We can eliminate option B. Option C tells us Italy was the first to use airplanes for military purposes, followed by Bulgaria and others until by the time of World War I, most nations were using them. Now we see that A and C are extremely close, quite close. So let's not still mark an answer just yet. Let's see if D gives us a better answer. We see that C makes the same mistake as A does. It mentions Italy first and then the use of airplanes for military purposes. C seems to be a little better because we have the use of airplanes for military purposes closer to the original subject as compared to A, which mentions this later. But we'll analyze this later on. We'll return to this. Let's first look at D. Let's see if we can find something which is better. D says the First World War saw a great proliferation in the use of airplanes for military purposes, even though earlier they were sparsely used by nations such as Italy or Bulgaria. Now we find that D is not at all a good option because first off, it distorts the order of subjects even further. It brings the First World War to the beginning, which is something that the passage mentions at the end. And then it says, while the first half is okay, it makes sense, the later half completely distorts the premise in saying, even though earlier they were sparsely used by nations such as Italy or Bulgaria. So they were used by Italy and Bulgaria, but then sparsely used, that is not supported by the passage. The argument of even though, we see that such an argument has not been made in the passage, so such an argument cannot be made. This kind of a comparison cannot be made in the summary as well. So D is clearly out. Now that makes this a little bit more challenging because we found that A and C both are very close, and then again A and C both make the same mistake. They mention Italy first and then the use of airplanes for military purposes. But if we look very closely and if we compare the two, there is no difference in the length of these two options. So by conciseness, they are almost identical. But we have now, if we look at it carefully, we have A slightly better because A starts with beginning with Italy in the early 20th century. Italy, yes. Early 20th century, these examples, yes, absolutely. 1911, 12, 1911 yet again. So early 20th century is also confirmed. The use of airplanes for military purposes. Now, look at the way that this is constructed. Beginning with something, the use of airplanes for military purposes. So when we have something which is connected by beginning with something, we find that here this phrase beginning with Italy in the early 20th century, this functions as a modifier. This functions almost like an adjective. So it functions like an adjective phrase. The use of airplanes for military purposes is the primary subject. Beginning with this, the use of airplanes for military purposes. So the key subject here, not the first in order, but the primary subject, is the use of airplanes for military purposes, which correlates with the passage. Now, if you look at C, Italy was the first to use airplanes for military purposes. This jumps right away to Italy. And here, Italy was, notice the verb in the word was. So Italy becomes the primary subject, and Italy is not the first subject in sequence. We see that the verb, the use of airplanes, use, is connected with airplanes for military purposes. That is what correlates to the passage. Before that, in option A, before that, beginning with Italy in the early 20th century, we don't have a verb here. So this in itself is not it's not a complete sentence. It is not a clause. It is just a phrase added to the later part. It just modifies when the later part gives us the primary subject, and that is the first subject from the passage. So we find that by comparison, while this is extremely close, by comparison, A is just a tad better than C. A is just one step closer than C. So by comparison, A is better and C is an inferior choice. We can thus qualify A, eliminate C. The correct answer, the most appropriate summary, is option A.